Hello, Tanse Yanin, and welcome to a brand new season of APTN InFocus. I'm Daryl Stranger. It's so nice to finally welcome you all back, where we will take a deeper look at a variety of stories throughout this upcoming season. Today, we're taking a look back at this year's National Day for Truth and Reconciliation. Now, just before I introduce you to some of the guests and interviews we have, let's take a look at some of what happened on September the 30th. In Ottawa, a couple thousand people came together on Parliament Hill to mark the third National Day for Truth and Reconciliation, a day to honor residential school survivors and the ones who didn't make it home. Here's Annette Francis with that story.
The Remembering the Children ceremony began with the Eagle River Singers Honor Song and an opening prayer with Claudette Commanda.
Without love, there's no healing. And what each and every one of our survivors pray for as we say this prayer from our heart today, let us show that love to the survivors.
It was a somber event, a time to show support, reflect, and entertain. Survivor Eddie Cote performed his residential school song. Onlookers sat and stood on the grounds. It was a sea of orange shirts and orange flags, and a few orange hearts as well. Richie Allen created them specifically for this event. She works at the Library and Archives of Canada.
I'd done work in these records, and I just knew I had to say something and do something. So part of doing something was making these hearts. I made a number of these hearts, and painted. Once they started having the National Day, I painted a couple orange to bring out the little ones for the little ones that didn't come back and we've yet to locate. And the big ones is for everybody.
Nancy Peel is a residential school survivor from Fort McMurray, Alberta. She says today is important so Canadians can understand the trauma of residential schools and its ongoing legacy. Peel says more than recognition is needed for survivors.
I think that it's not to throw money at them. It's to come up with some innovative healing programs that will walk people through the trauma and the damage that's been done.
An emotional and visual impact of the event was the procession of the ceremonial red cloth. It bears the names of over 4,000 children who died while attending residential schools. Quanah Travis helped to carry it through the crowd and to the stage.
It's covered in people who went and didn't come home. And the fact that for even 10 minutes of my life I was able to carry them to a place where they could be honored was probably one of the proudest moments of my life.
With the day coming to an end, most here agree healing and reconciliation will continue into the future. Annette Francis, APTN National News, Ottawa.
Now, I was in Ottawa for this year's special event, Remembering the Children. A couple of guests joined me before and after the event. Now, our first interview today is with Claudette Commanda, a well-respected Algonquin elder in the Ottawa area, which you saw a little bit of in Annette's story. Here's my interview with her. Yes, I'm here with Claudette Commanda. Claudette is a well-respected Algonquin elder here in the Ottawa area, and you were also the first Indigenous Chancellor of the University of Ottawa, right? So thank you, miigwech to you, Claudette, for joining us here on this special day. So thank you.
Well, thank you for welcoming me to come here and to join you to say some words. So
what are you thinking of today on this September 30th?
I'm thinking about the survivors. I'm thinking about the residential school survivors, those that continue to be here with us, those that not return home, and of course, the children that continue to be in those unmarked graves. But I'm also thinking about the beauty of life, and the love, and the love that we are all bringing together to show that love and that honor and that respect for the survivors. And also I'm thinking about my own family who are survivors. The father of my children and my children, they are survivors of Indian residential schools.
Yeah, that's really well said, Claudette. And it's been just over a year since the Pope's apology. Have you seen anything different since that apology in this last year?
I have not seen anything different. I have not. And if we're going to speak words of truth, after all, today is the National Day of Truth and Reconciliation. And if there's going to be reconciliation and healing, there has to be truth. So I'm speaking my truth. I have not seen anything different. It was just words that were spoken. So where is the action that's coming from the Pope's apology? I have not seen it.
So then just in turn with that, Claudette, what would you like to see change? What are some of the things that you'd like to see different as we move forward?
Well, I think what's really important is that the voice of the survivors always have to be heard and understood. It's the survivors that have to say what's needed and how it has to be done. And there has to be the Government of Canada. The Government of Canada has a role in all of this too. The Government of Canada has to hold those churches accountable for what they did to our people. And it's so important. Accountability is important. It speaks about truth. Accountability. So what I want to see is the churches being accountable, the federal government holding churches accountable, the federal government putting First Nations, Inuit, and Métis people first and foremost, and the voices of the survivors must be the lead. They must be the lead on everything and anything that is relating to truth and reconciliation.
Now, Claudia, as I mentioned just off the top there, you were the first Indigenous Chancellor of the University of Ottawa, and congratulations, by the way. That's a great honor. And just how are you using that role to, help Indigenous communities and people and non-Indigenous, how are you using your role to sort of move forward reconciliation?
Very good question. Education. And I'll reflect on the words of Justice Murray Sinclair when he said it was education that got us into this. It's education going to take us out of this. So education. Most importantly, it's to promote my people, the Algonquin people whose land that the university is on, and talk about our history, who we are as a people, and also Indigenous peoples to raise the fact that Indigenous wisdom has been here since time immemorial. Our knowledges, our ways of knowing and being and doing, but also to educate all non-Indigenous peoples at the university, from the administration to the staff to the students, the history of Canada. The history of Canada. Pre-contact history, colonial history, Canadian history, and it's so important, history. In order to know where you're going, you have to know where you come from, and Canada needs to know where they come from. And so that is something that I will promote on the foundation of truth, honesty, history, and reflection, for them to reflect who they are as Canadians. And it's important that we walk together on that road of reconciliation, but it's going to be on the principles of truth and education.
Really well said. Yeah, absolutely. Really well said. And I mean, some provinces still don't recognize the National Day for Truth and Reconciliation as a statutory holiday. I mean, just a stone's throw away across the Ottawa River over in Quebec, they don't. I mean, what do you make of that? How do you feel about that? That, it's still not a day for them?
Well, the question I ask is why not? Like, it's a simple question, like, why not? And why can't they answer that in a simple way? I mean, if every province that doesn't believe that this should be a statutory holiday, they should look at themselves and say, well, they are part of this journey of reconciliation. Absolutely. So they should step up to the plate. They should respect that what September 30th stands for. And if they don't want to make it in a statutory holiday, then the very least they should be doing, all these provinces, they should be having these activities to honor, to remember, and show respect to the Indian residential school survivors.
Absolutely. And just when it comes to reconciliation, I mean, small things like renaming streets and taking down some statues, they're relatively easy, and renaming bridges and that sort of thing. But what are some of the bigger issues that you'd like to see governments tackle?
Honor the treaties. Honor the treaties. We've all heard the slogan, land back. We need to have access to all our lands, not just reserve lands, but all our ancestral lands. We need to have the jurisdiction of our lands and natural resources. The Government of Canada, or even Canadians in general, because they're all part of this, they need to understand what their constitutional law is. It's Section 9124, what that fiduciary obligation that the federal government and even Canadians owe to First Nations people. Very important. The other part is that First Nations people have to have we always have to be at the table. Everything and anything related, especially if they're going to be making laws that's going to impact our people, we need to be there. And it's not just about consulting. It's about we have decision-making power. After all, we have been here since time immemorial, long before 1867 when the Government of Canada became in existence.
Well, Claudette, that's a lot of what you said is really well said, and I'm sure a lot of our audience who's listening to this is going to resonate a lot with what you said. But I do know you're a part of this ceremony. I believe you're giving the blessing, right? So I want to thank you just for taking a few minutes and speaking with us today on a day like this. So thank you, Miigwech, to you. The Remembering the Children special event was really quite powerful and emotional. Now, while the event was wrapping up, Stephanie Scott, the Executive Director for the National Centre for Truth and Reconciliation, also joined me in Ottawa. I'm joined here by Stephanie Scott, the Executive Director of the National Centre for Truth and Reconciliation. So, Stephanie, thank you so much for taking a few minutes of your time today for us. What a powerful event today was. It was emotional. It made you think about, the past and the future. What did you take away from today, Stephanie?
Well, today as I sit here and I look out across the sea of orange, I really feel blessed, not only because of all the work that we do with survivors and their families and communities, that people are finally listening and paying attention. And on the National Day for Truth and Reconciliation, that is of the utmost importance, not only for survivors, their families, but for Canadians to heal as a whole.
And what was it like for you to see the support and the allies here for the survivors and their families, and just like you said, to see all of the orange? What did that mean to you?
Well, I've been doing this work for 13 years. I'm the daughter of a survivor. I'm a 60 Scoop survivor. And I started working with the Truth and Reconciliation Commission I've been doing it for 13 years. So I was the manager of statement gathering. I've been all over this country, all across the land. And what survivors had asked time and time again is, please share what has happened to me so that this never happens again to any children, anywhere, anytime. And when you think about today, you have to remember that these were children, the most vulnerable little ones in our country. And the fact that people have turned out in droves, they've come to hear the survivors speak. The Governor General was here. We have Indigenous and non-Indigenous people on the grounds. And I really do feel blessed that not only for APTN to support this work and all of our partners and organizations. When we started this work, we had one broadcaster. Then we went to 3. Then we went to 13. This year we have 18 broadcasters across the country that have reached out, sharing the information, hoping to educate Canadians so that everybody understands and we can move forward together in truth and reconciliation.
Yeah. Well, on the topic of educating, Canadians in the world alike of what's happened, there are still a lot of people who are deniers and don't believe in what's happened. I mean, what do you say to them, and what can be done to sort of curb that denialism as we go forward here?
Well, for everyone that denies that this took place and this happened, it's hard to listen to survivors and not understand that truth. We have 4 million records at the National Centre for Truth and Reconciliation right now. I've been in those archives. I've seen records from parents, handwritten letters from fathers, mothers, grandparents that talk about, how could you have taken my child away? How could you have not told me that they've died? How could you have placed them in a pauper's grave and never known where they lay or have been buried? So we've been working very closely with the federal government, the churches, organizations in order to understand the truth of what happened to those children. Today we know that there's 4,140 names on the National Memorial Register. Just a couple of weeks ago in the Senate called witnesses. Another couple of hundred names that we were unaware of will be added to that register. We're going to get 23 million more records. Every time I talk to the federal government, it continues to grow. The last number was potentially 30 million records. So we got to a certain point in truth and time during the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, but we're going to have to do research, public education for decades to come, because we know there's a long way to go in this country, and I may not be around when that happens, but I am blessed that I am able to do this work and that I can do it not only for my family, but my daughters and my grandchildren and their children to come.
Well, that's a wonderful response and just a wonderful message, really, Stephanie. And I want to say thank you, Miigwech, to you for sharing a bit of the story and some time with us after this beautiful event. So thank you, Miigwech, to you.
Miigwech.
All right, we've reached a point in our show where we need to step aside for a quick break. We still have plenty more APTN in Focus to come, so don't go anywhere. Do you have a question or comment? Send your thoughts to infocus@aptn.ca. Share your voice with APTN in Focus on your favorite social media and watch live on APTN News, YouTube, and TikTok. Welcome back to APTN in Focus. In British Columbia, the Stolo Nation recently announced 158 confirmed deaths of children that attended 3 residential schools and 1 hospital within their territory. They also announced that anomalies suspected to be unmarked graves were also found, but have yet to release that number because it's early on in the investigation. APTN video journalist Tina House was joined by 2 guests to talk further about this discovery and about some of the challenges for Indigenous nations in seeking the truth. And a warning, some of the details may be hard to hear.
Tansei, I'm Tina House. We're here on the former property that was once known as the St. Mary's Indian Residential School just outside of Mission, BC. Joining me today on my panel is Mike Kelly, a former student, as well as Lorraine Nizell, who now works for the First Nations Health Authority. Mike, I want to begin with you. Earlier today, they revealed some very troubling results of their ground-penetrating radar and all of their archaeology research that they've done here. How are you feeling right now, Mike? Because I know myself, I'm feeling very disturbed and very troubled by the news that there are unmarked anomalies here on this property right now.
Oh, when they first brought it out this morning, I was really re-traumatized from death that I know of in the old school there. And thanks to Lorraine here, she helped me walk me through that traumatic time.
Do you feel lucky that you made it out alive, knowing that so many others didn't?
Looking back at my life, I don't believe luck has anything to do with it. It's because I changed my life when I was in my 20s and started working for our Creator, and I find myself burying all my family and friends that I grew up with, went to school with. All my teachers are gone from this faith, and I believe that I'm here because Creator God wants me here yet.
Mike, you're also now a healer as well. Tell us about some of the work that you do to help others that are dealing with trauma.
I use the way I learned is hands-on healing. I pray with ones that have trauma, grief and loss, burdens and everything, and any messages, I'll relay them, or at least when no messages, I could feel the pain coming off of them and them letting go of the pains that they're carrying.
Can you tell us a little bit more about your experience when you went to school here? How old were you and what was that first day like? Do you remember that day?
I was 9 years old when I went to school at the old school over there in 1956. And first off, the first year was really puzzling because it's all new and had to learn everything, learn the rules, go by the rules, get the strap, whatever. We got strapped for stepping out of line, talking when we're not supposed to be talking in church. The nuns had a yardstick, that kind of stuff. And it's all learning what to do and how to do things according to the rules.
So very militarized, in your opinion, is how you would summarize your experience at residential school.
After a while, when I was going through court, I told the people that those people in concentration camps over on the inside the world had it better than we do, because we weren't allowed to speak unless spoken to or ask a question. We become docile. When I was in court there, and I told the courts, I said, we became docile because we couldn't do anything, say anything, move, or step out of line there or get the strap. So we learned how to listen and shut up.
That just breaks my heart, Mike, because you were just a child. Going back to some of the information that was shared with us today, it was very troubling to hear about when this old school burnt down, that the firemen came and actually found fetuses in the walls of that school. That just shook me to my core. I mean, this is horrific information that was shared publicly. Knowing that 158 children died at just these 4 locations, that only just 2% of the St. Mary's former school here was searched so far, and already they've uncovered anomalies. Lorraine, you work extensively in this field now. You work with a number of organizations. Tell me about some of the work that you do.
I am very much involved with 10 Indian residential school projects across BC. One of the largest is the Indian Residential School Survivors Society, and then the second largest is Southern Laleham Healing Society. And we are health and cultural supports to 210 plus First Nations across BC, as well as we have missing and murdered Indigenous women and girls programs throughout the 5 FNHA regions, as well as Indian Day School. Lately, we've rolled out funding to help with the trauma, the ongoing trauma that folks have been dealing with in community. And last but not least is we support the 18 IRS sites and the 3 Indian hospital site communities with the work that they're doing, which brings us here today.
Obviously, you see a parallel between residential school and now murdered and missing Indigenous women and girls across this country. Lorraine, what are some of the challenges for you to continue to do the work to support the projects and the many amazing people in the front lines trying to help people in their trauma?
I would have to say that the challenge is since the Aboriginal Healing Foundation was no longer in existence, they did a transfer of funding over to, in our case in BC, First Nations Health Authority. That funding base has not changed ever. And there is no way that 10 organizations can meet the needs of 210 plus communities. And just really, we're statistically noticing a real spike, especially since the 215 and to Kamloops, a real spike in needs for communities. They're dealing with grief, they're dealing with loss, they're dealing with the opioid crisis, and this 215 issue and the missing children is just tugging away at all our hearts. And finding the resources to adequately address that is very hard to do on a funding parameter that only goes year to year. We need long-term sustainable funding.
Absolutely, and I think certainly hearing information that there's even more suspected unmarked graves being uncovered here just outside of Mission, BC, it's triggering for many. Mike, can you tell me about when you were a young man? I know you shared with me earlier that you actually ran away 26 times while you were a student here. Share with us an experience that you remember of you running away.
Well, when I was 10 years old, me and my stepbrother, my brother wanted to go home. I said, "Why, you want to go home now?" And he said, "Yeah." And then our next door neighbor, he was 6 years old and first year of school here in 1957. So I said, "Okay, we're going to go after dark." And we took off. And it took us 3 days to get from here to Hope. And I tell that story every once in a while that we were running away from a car one time and there was just this little drain ditch. We were crawling inside the pipe there. We don't know if that guy saw us or not, but nothing happened. We made it home anyway.
Wow.
We ate apples and pears and whatever we could in the fields, on our journey, and that's what kept us moving.
Incredible. What a story.
Mm-hmm.
Mike, thank you so much for sharing that with us. I think that it really shows the resiliency and the survivor and the power of many of our people that endured this horrific experience. Lorraine, this is obviously very difficult for so many people to hear the information that was shared here in Stolo territory. What can people do to find their help and their healing in this very difficult time?
I know that there are a lot of numbers that people can call. There's crisis lines with the Indian residential school survivors. There's crisis lines with Southern Laleham. They can contact the First Nations Health Authority for a list of resources. And really, at the end of the day, I heard Mike say earlier that we lean on the Creator, the grandfathers, the grandmothers, the ancestors. We lean into the land to help us make it through these times when they're this troubling and really touch our hearts. So I really believe in the power of the creation that's all around us and the life that's all around us.
Indeed. Mike, any final words on that time that you went to school here that you could leave us with?
The education was good, but the rest of it wasn't. I liked playing soccer and basketball and baseball here, and when I left, I ran far away as I could, and I went to California, and then I wound up going to school down there and I got my GED and a bunch of other engine overhaul degrees and stuff like that when I went back to school in California.
How are you feeling, Mike, hearing that these were unmarked graves, potentially graves of your schoolmates here on these grounds where you literally played soccer?
I didn't hear about it till after I grew up and after I was already in my healing journey. So it was something through our lives, we always knew that they were there, and there was always children that went to school and didn't come home, and that was a big eye-opener when I walked into that 215 in Kamloops there. So I stayed there and I supported them for a couple of days before I came home.
Yeah. Mike, thank you so much for sharing with us. Thank you so much for joining us. Lorraine, thank you so much for joining us as well. This is very, very impactful information that you've shared with us, and we really do appreciate it. Thank you so much. Thank you so much for joining us today, and back to you in studio.
Well, the National Indian Residential School Crisis Line is available for survivors and others who might need support. That number is 1-866-925-4419. Well, more than 5 million records pertaining to residential schools across Canada are held in the archives at the National Centre for Truth and Reconciliation. Still, there are many more records held within different institutions across the globe. Sav Jones has sat down with the head of the archives to learn what might be missing and how gathering these vital documents is going.
I'm here at the National Centre for Truth and Reconciliation, and with me is the head of the archives, Raymond Frogner. Thanks so much for joining me today, Raymond.
My pleasure.
My first question is, what are the archives documents on residential schools used for, and how do they help survivors?
Well, the documents were actually collected by the Truth and Reconciliation Commission after the Indian Residential School Settlement Agreement was struck between federal government and federal and provincial governments, different church organizations, as well as Indigenous representation, to understand the history and legacy of the residential school experience. So these records now exist for survivors, their families, communities, as well as researchers to consult, interrogate the nature of oppression, the way that the system of residential schools operated, the impact it had on communities, and how it actually has had an impact on the very nature of the identity of Canadian society.
It's been said that the Vatican has over 1,000 items of residential school documents, and the NCTR has been trying to retrieve them. What kind of information may be in those documents, and what does it say that they are still being held onto a year after the apology?
There is approximately, I would say, 1,000 photographs held at the Oblate Records Center, which is a Catholic order that has an archive in Rome. And those photographs still remain with the Oblate Order's archive in Rome. My recommendation was to scan them and actually return the originals to their home communities, because from what I could tell, the photos themselves were not really being used in the Oblate Order archives. Even if we got digital copies, it could be a first step towards communities going through those photos and recognizing the names of children in the photos, which at this point, none of the photos are described. So that could be a tremendous benefit. For the Vatican archives, I do think there is a large number of materials that missionaries, priests, other Catholic representatives have collected over time, from ceremonies, from gifts, from other occasions, and they've basically been returned to the Vatican for storage. I don't know how often they've ever been actually made, put into public display. Those also could be returned to home communities, I think, if the church wanted to promote the concept of reconciliation with the communities that they had worked with in those schools.
And earlier this year, Manitoba agreed to provide greater access to the death certificates of children at residential schools. How is that going, and have they been provided?
They did, and the way the negotiations occurred, we provided the Manitoba Vital Stats with a list of names that we could identify of children from Manitoba residential schools. And they used that list to identify within their Vital Stats databases those documents they held that documented the lives of those children and the deaths of those children. We also put into that agreement that this is an ongoing annual review, so that as our research continues to go forward and we find more names of children that have passed away at schools in Manitoba, we will submit those to Manitoba Vital Stats, and we fully expect to continue to receive more records from them.
And are there any other provinces who are cooperating with providing residential school documents? Or? Any that refuse?
No one's ever refused, I would say. Some of the discussions have been very long and protracted. For example, Saskatchewan has never produced the records of vital stats with us, and neither has Quebec, but we've been in positive discussions with both of those jurisdictions.
And what more needs to be done by the Canadian government to ensure survivors have access to their historical documents of residential schools?
At the moment, we are working, quite recently, the federal government struck a committee called the Document Acquisition Committee. And the goal of that committee was to do another full and comprehensive review of the various ministries' records to find any records that document the history and legacy of residential schools. So this includes, health, Indian Affairs, Library and Archives Canada, National Film Board, all of the federal government institutions that might have records of those schools. So to date, it's been estimated that there'll probably be about 23 million more records coming to us from the federal government based on that project. They are currently being digitized, collated and brought to CIRNAC, Crown Indigenous Relations, and from Crown Indigenous Relations they'll be sent to us. But that would be the biggest contribution that, in terms of purely records.
Well, we'll have to end it there, Raymond, but thank you so much for joining me today.
Thank you.
Thank you.
All right, it is time for one final break here on the program. We have one more interview to come, so make sure you stick around. Welcome back to APTN in Focus. Our next guest joining us is Chadwick Cowie from the Hiawatha First Nation in Ontario. He is an assistant professor in the Department of Political Science at the University of Toronto, and he specializes in researching whether or not Indigenous peoples' participation in Canadian federal electoral politics can bring about change and reconciliation. And he also assists with research and knowledge gathering on behalf of his community. Chadwick, thank you so much for joining us here today. First off, can you share with our audience a bit of the work that you do over at the university?
Yes. First of all, thank you for having me. So I currently am an assistant professor at the University of Toronto. I work at the Scarborough and the downtown St. George campus. My areas of focus are labeled as Canadian and comparative politics, but I do Indigenous politics. So I do a lot of stuff of Canadian Indigenous relations, Indigenous participation in Canadian electoral politics, representation, as well as looking at federalism, constitutionalism. As well as on that side, I also work as a researcher for my community and the other 5 Mississauga communities that exist in this, what we would call Southern Ontario by Canadian maps today.
So given some of your work then, Chadwick, can you describe for us a bit of what you see between the relationship between the Crown and Indigenous people, and maybe how that's changed over the years, especially more recently?
Yes. Well, when we're talking about that relationship, there's different ones. So my nation and other members of the Anishinaabe obviously were aligned with the French Crown before the 7-year or the 8 Years' War. So what you see in 1764 with the Wampums and Niagara is the first establishment of positive friendship and relationships with the British Crown, what is now what we see as King Charles III today. That relationship is supposed to establish a nation-to-nation relationship. It's supposed to establish an allyship, a friendship, one where we're able to move forward together without impeding on one another. As time goes on, we start to see that change as responsible government is given to British settlers, especially those who are part of the British Empire. And as time goes on, 1867, the establishment of the Dominion of Canada, where Canada is given dominion over Indigenous people, especially status Indians specifically, in 1867 and going into 1876 with the Indian Act. So we start to see more responsibility given to the Canadian state without us as our own nations being a part of that or being included in that. It becomes more unilateral, and you start to see the influence of the Crown kind of move more to a figurehead status, as you would say. So we see from Queen Victoria, there's a lot of interaction going on, especially with East Coast nations, Central nations, prior to her passing away in 1901, and we don't see that really uptick again until Queen Elizabeth II, when she comes in the 50s, and we start to see the scaling back of the control that has been that the Canadian state has used from we start to see that scaling back in the 60s going on. But we also see during that time kind of a loss of memory in regards to what that nation-to-nation relationship is supposed to be, and that relationship is with the sovereign, as allies, as friends, as fellow nations talking with each other, not necessarily with the Canadian state. The Canadian state gets its legitimacy from the Crown, but at the same time, it also gets that legitimacy because of that relationship between our nations with the Crown over the years, over the last 400 years. So you start to see kind of a reminder of this, and the Crown comes back into more play with the patriation of the Constitution Act of 1982. We know that some of our leaders go over to Britain to push them to make sure that there is some parts that are included, or that Indigenous people are included. So when we have Section 35 and 25, there's a component of that comes from the British government, but also the pressing, from what I understand, of the Crown, to make sure that we are discussing that. Are we fully included properly? Well, we can say that we're not, and there's still questions about how that works on that. But going forward, when we're talking about reconciliation, we see, especially with the new king over the last year, that even prior to him being the king when he was Prince of Wales, there was interest in a lot of items that relates to our nations, as well as territorial, environment, but also in regards to, in a sense, reconciliation. And we see that change that has been starting to occur with him as king since last September, with how he's been approaching some of the nations that we're talking about, not just in territory shared with Canada, but in other places like Aotearoa, as well as what we call Australia.
Well, as you just mentioned there with the most recent King Charles here, you previously wrote in an article that you're cautiously optimistic for this new relationship, and you sort of briefly described it. Can you go into a bit more detail why you're a bit optimistic maybe when it comes to King Charles?
So whenever there's a change, it's the same thing with Canadian elections and the way I approach it. I'm depending on how it is and what they say, one thing is said well before they're in the role, or before, for instance, in Canada, the Prime Minister. It can be the same thing with how the monarchy changes once there is a new sovereign. The way he's approaching it seems to be a lot different. He's already had some mindsets, it seems, from while he was Prince of Wales that he wanted to see implemented. So we know that on his coronation, the first person he went and greeted and shook hands with was the Maori King. That showed a huge change with how that has been done. And then obviously recently in July, myself and 3 other delegates from the Mississauga Nation, alongside Nathan Tidrid, who teaches down in the Hamilton area, and Veronica Lowe, who is representing the Stephen Lowe Foundation that helped for funding this, went over to actually as a delegation, a diplomatic delegation, to go meet with them. And we met with him at a garden party in at Holyrood Palace House, or Holyrood House Palace in Edinburgh. And we were the first delegate group that he met. So we were the first of probably 8,000 people that were attending that garden party where he had time to come and talk to us. And so there were 6 of us as the delegation, 4 of us from the Mississauga Nation, and we each got at least 2 to 2.5 minutes to talk to him. And he made sure, from what I understand, that we were the first people that he'd come talk to, because it was a nation meeting another nation. It was a delegation. It was a diplomatic thing. So there's protocol, and he made sure that was followed, compared to how in the past, the Canadian state would obviously prefer that they're the ones who are recognized first, because they are the ones who look at themselves as having the sovereignty ability and being a part of the Commonwealth, and that they are the ones who have the legitimization because they're a state. But we forget again that long-standing relationship with the Crown needs to be reminded, and we go back to that 1764 wampum, because that is what actually establishes the relationships where we're supposed to coexist alongside each other, going down that path together without interfering with one another.
Well, so with that visit, what was that experience like to be over in the United Kingdom and to meet King Charles? I mean, just what was that whole sort of experience like?
It was interesting. Growing up, I'm sure like anyone else who has had a chance to meet the monarch, never necessarily expected that was going to happen. It just so happened that I was fortunate that my community of Hiawatha First Nation, or Pemidashkadayong in our language, asked if I would be able to attend on their behalf. Our chief and council, our band council system, chief and council, were not able to attend due to their scheduling, and so I was asked to do, because of the research work I'm doing to help to pull together our history as a nation and our contemporary existence. So I was asked to go alongside of it, which was really neat, because it also marked the first time that a diplomatic delegation from the Mississauga Nation on its own had met with the Crown since 1860. The last time we met with them, Catherine Sutton, who was born into what we call the Mississaugas of the Credit First Nation back in the 1830s, had visited with Queen Victoria in 1860 at Buckingham Palace. But not too long after that, the Prince of Wales, who would become King Edward VII, also came over to do a tour on behalf of Queen Victoria, and he actually stopped in my community back in the August of 1860, where he met with my hereditary chief. He did this whole thing from Newfoundland right down through what we would call Ontario, and then he did a private tour of the United States. But he actually stopped in Hiawatha First Nation for a day and actually met. And there's not a lot of documentation on it. We know that he was there, though. We have gifts that the women from our community gave him when he was there, and they're now currently on viewing from the Royal Collection Trust in Peterborough. But we know that he met with them, and that was the last time that a diplomatic conversation had happened between the Crown and my nation. So this was a re-establishment of that, a reminder of that relationship, and trying to rejuvenate that friendship, that relationship that we're supposed to have, and walking down that path together into the future.
Well, and then just one more.
Very interesting.
Yeah, no, it certainly sounds like it. And just one more on the visit for you on a personal level. I mean, what was that like? Yet you analyze, all these relationships in the Crown and sort of that. So I just on a personal level, I mean, what was sort of that experience like?
It was interesting. So, and from a personal level, because again, studying this is some of the areas that I focus on. If I'm talking Indigenous Canadian relations, it's always a component of it. It's a very key factor that we have to consider when we're discussing that relationship. There's a lot of animosity towards the Crown, and I can understand why, because King Edward VII, his successor, and so on, there's a lot of very Eurocentric mentality. We're also talking about an institution. So when we're talking about that as well, we need to remember that there are multiple people involved with that, and sometimes they're not passing along the information between those who are supposed to. And a good example of this would be, again, Catherine Sutton, who followed her uncle Peter Jones. They went over to Queen Victoria to lobby her to have title recognized for their community, the credit, in order for it to be protected. So that way they didn't have to worry about the state or eventually what would become Canada coming in and claiming it and saying that they did not have any claim over their own territory. They were farming it. They had decided and opted to transition to the way Europeans were utilizing the territory. Queen Victoria agreed. She was going to do that. She said, yes, the title should be recognized. Unfortunately, the person who was the go-in-between was also very much had self-interest in the territory over here because he came from over here too. So that message was never passed along and that title was never recognized. So we have examples here where the Crown does this, but at the same time, for me being there, I'm also thinking of who is behind the scenes that you have to keep in mind and you have to keep track of, because they're also pulling strings from within it, because they're there to protect the institution, to make sure it keeps going, not necessarily change with time. So while I'm meeting with King Charles, it was a great conversation with him. I talked about my community. I had a chance to express that I teach political science at the University of Toronto, and how we kind of had a little bit of a conversation about what my students felt and thought about me. But it's interesting to be able to talk to him, but know that, how much work he has to do and probably wants to do. He also has to deal with the people who are going to push back at him through the structure, because the structure is how it's always supposed to be. So I'm keeping that in mind. So meeting with him, that's why I say cautiously optimistic, because he wants to do stuff. It seems very clear that he wants to do that, and he's trying. He's made some changes already just in his first year with how he's approached Indigenous nations, which we see he was trying to do that while he was Prince of Wales. But how is this going to reflect? How is this going to work with the institution? So it was very humbling to meet with him. Again, the entire time I'm meeting with him, I'm picturing what it could have been like when his great grandfather had came over and actually visited my community. I didn't get a chance to share with him. So the folklore, and from what we know is documented, how Hiawatha First Nation gets named Hiawatha First Nation is that his great grandfather fell in love with the poem Hiawatha. When he happened to visit our community, it reminded him of the poem. So he had suggested that our name be changed to Hiawatha, and of course that's what was done. So that's how we become Hiawatha. So thinking of that, even that colonial construct that comes into it, that you have someone making an edict like that, and obviously he doesn't necessarily, I would say that he doesn't necessarily agree with that idea, and how he's trying to approach stuff. Again, it's also going against, 300 years of what is established. Not only that, but how he's going to reconcile and maneuver that relationship with the Canadian state, who claims their own legitimacy based off of the fact that they're the ones recognized around the world, or ones who are recognized through the 1867 Constitution Act and the 1982 Constitution Act. So how they react and how they reflect on this is how Canada will reflect on this is also very important. And so I'm thinking of all that there's still a lot of work that has to be done, especially when recognizing and meeting with Indigenous nations quite often competes with the self-interest of the Canadian state.
Mm-hmm. Well, Chadwick, given everything that you've just said, I mean, I'm learning a lot, and I'm sure the audience as well is learning a bit more about these relationships. But given everything we've talked about so far, can you predict, or maybe that's not the right term, but can you predict, or what do you hope maybe lies ahead here as we go forward with these relations, and then maybe what would you like to see?
Well, from what I understand, King Charles does like to read a lot. He likes to learn a lot. He likes history. He likes understanding relations. It's something that he does. So presenting a copy of the wampum, one of the wampum belts from 1764, kind of reestablishes that. And I would hope that he has taken the time to either go learn about it if he hadn't already, or if he had, he's still picking more pieces apart from it and looking into it and establishing and understanding what the significance of giving that remake of that belt. We don't know, I think, from what my understanding is, well, we don't know where those original belts are anymore. So this is a remake that we know because it's been described in some of the writings that have existed at the time. But that he's keeping that in mind as he's looking to go forward, and that he understands that there's going to be pushback in my mind, but I think that he seems to be willing to work with that and be able to figure out ways around that. I'm cognizant that this may take time because there's a whole structure that has been in place since 1867, even earlier than that, 1850s, 1840s, even right back to 1783 after the American state is formed, that has to be reflected and analyzed more carefully when we're looking at going for this. So I have hope, and that's why I say cautious optimism, because there seems to be a want to, and there's some pushback that you see that I would say you can see from how he's approached certain things, of how things have always been done, and You know, he's wanted to be a modern king. He's wanted to be a modern prince and be a 21st century. So we'll see how that goes and what that will look like going forward. And unfortunately, I'm sure it's safe to say we're not going to have as much time with him as we had with Queen Elizabeth. So what he's able to do while he's still on the throne will be questions, and whether or not Canada will continue to even be a part of the Commonwealth. We know that some people in Canada want to see it become a republic. How does that reflect that relationship? We've already seen a Supreme Court ruling against the Jay Treaty back in the 50s that shows that at times the court has ruled that because Canada did not exist at the time of a treaty, it does not necessarily have to reflect it or recognize it. So is this something that we have to worry about going forward if it goes that route? So more Canadians need to be understand this, and hopefully hopefully King Charles will be able to help lend that voice to it, especially when he does official visits here into our territory that we share with Canada.
Well, Chadwick, we'll certainly be keeping an eye on all of this as this moves forward, but we'll have to leave it there. Again, thank you so much for coming on and sharing a bit of insight. I know, like I said, I've learned a lot, and I'm sure our audience is learning a lot about these relations and why they're important in sort of what you see. So again, thank you so much for coming on, and we do appreciate it.
Miigwech, thank you for having me.
All right, that's going to do it for our first episode of the new APTN InFocus season. Today's episode will be available as a podcast. You can listen and subscribe on aptnnews.ca/podcasts, or you can find us on your favorite player. And if you missed any of the previous seasons and you maybe want to catch up, you can find those and more on aptnnews.ca/infocus. Now, next week is an on-location episode at the Indigenomics She Conference, so make sure you tune in to that. We'll leave you with a wonderful performance from Rai Moran in Ottawa. For the entire team, thank you so much for joining us. Miigwech, Kanashkamatin, and have a great night. I can't figure out just how we live without, 'cause I feel you here. I feel